Character armor in modern civilization. This paper will look to relate alcohol use disorder with identity and character armor that individuals develop in their early lives. Character armor, as defined formally by Ernest Becker in The Denial of Death, is the set of psychological defense mechanisms that one uses to protect themselves from anxiety and from the problems of individual and social life. One's character armor in modern day filters the tremendous mysteries and terrors of existence so that living feels more manageable and purposeful. Character armor is necessary but majorly subject to the hero system that an individual is born into. The hero system lays out the conditions by which an individual may develop their heroic sense of identity, whether it be through science, owning a nice house, or raising a family, as some particular examples. While hero systems and character armor are necessary components of a functioning society, it still appears necessary to understand exactly how this character armor may develop. The psychosocial dynamics of our current societal landscape allows individuals to shy away from the true nature of the human condition, sheltering themselves with character armor and layer upon layer of illusion. It leads to an inevitable implosion where the price to pay is an egregious dissonance that the individual experiences in their own mind, intrinsically in their own mind, and then extrinsically in the relation to the world in which they live. The result of this dissonance can take any of the varying forms of mental illness we see in modern day, and which is why this topic is particularly important and of the utmost concern. Exposure to certain realms of the human condition can be a cause of sickness in the mind. But paradoxically, it would appear that acknowledging the human condition in its totality and reconciling one's place within it could also be a solution to the sickness in the mind. Inversely related, refusing to acknowledge this cause of sickness in the mind, or the inability to comprehend the cause, either due to limited resources that are available to the individual or intentional ignorance, is an inevitable loss of control, courage, and heroism. To discuss what it actually means to acknowledge the human condition in its totality is beyond the scope of this essay. Introduction. The literature and ideology in modern civilization appears to be growing in a direction that puts more emphasis on the biological and chemical processes as a prerequisite for any individual that falls under a category of being mentally ill. We can observe many perspectives that use arguments coinciding with the idea of things such as the depression gene, the addiction gene, and so on and so forth. Quote, "Give them a pill that alters their neurophysiology back to normal, and they'll be as good as new." This perspective is almost always ignorant to the mysterium tremendum et fascinans of existence, not taking into account the human condition as a factor of anxiety that every human being must face. As the topic of mental illness in modern civilization appears to be highly stigmatized, I do not want to lay any definitive claim on any subject under contention that revolves around mental illness. What I do wish to attempt is to articulate and emphasize a perspective on mental health that I believe is lacking in modern civilization. The merits of biological research, as it particularly pertains to neurobiology, and the constituent disciplines within neurobiology are fundamentally crucial in modern civilization's quest towards wisdom and betterment for all. I acknowledge the various merits of biological research that have bore fruit to modern civilization on a global scale. But, and as we will see throughout this paper, it has become all too easy for individuals in modern civilization to rely on these biological discoveries and frameworks. In relying on these frameworks as the end-all be-all for the cause, treatment, and solution to all things related to mental illness, individuals are reluctant to maintain an open mind to perhaps other detrimental causes that many would brutally claim are, quote, right under their nose. I lay claim that the biological frameworks, in addition to the framework I will look to provide in this paper, can be used in conjunction as a methodology for alleviating the current mass myopia of existence in the human condition. Alcohol use disorder. Quote, and here Kierkegaard's analysis becomes the most telling. He is attempting to ferret people out of the lie of their lives, whose lives do not look like a lie, who seem to succeed in being true, complete, and authentic persons. Ernest Becker, The Denial of Death, 1973. In modern civilization, it is of no use to attempt a dialogue about mental illness with any random individual. We can attribute this to the idea of character armor, a specific sort of protection that an individual uses to shelter themselves from that which they may or may not know can disrupt their homeostasis and well-being. We can see this on display when we observe how most people dismiss any and all claims that they have not been exposed to, don't understand, or don't agree with. Specifically, when dealing with sensitive and perhaps the most important subjects such as politics, religion, mental illness, suicide, and so on, people are quick to be dismissive of ideas that are formulated from an unfamiliar realm. They rely on the dogmatic nature of certain institutions to relay a message that they themselves do not fully understand. That is, most people will propagate ideas and wisdom from sources they have been told are reliable, without fully understanding the reasoning or consequences of the ideas they are propagating. They argue for that which they don't fully understand while holding an assumption that they do in fact understand fully. And, specifically as a causal link to the shelter inside their character armor, they maintain their positions as unmalleable, absolute, and that zero critique could ever change their mind. Most do not wish to entertain the idea that their position could be wrong. Even worse, they do not entertain the idea that they themselves could be wrong, acting in accordance with something that is wrong, and in adhering to a framework of living life that is not as good as it could be. And so, as an attempt to mitigate themselves from exposure to their wrongdoing and irrational or less good ideas, they create any and all rationalizations to defend their position. To defend one's position, one is really defending oneself, their personality, identity, ethical framework, heroic justifications, life purpose, and so on and so forth. Excuse me. One second. Character armor is both a necessity and a burden, for if one truly wishes to maintain an open mind towards existence and down a path towards wisdom, one needs to identify the weak spots in their armor. It is a necessity because one needs character armor to live and navigate in the world, but one also needs to identify weak spots in their armor if one wishes to live well. And typically, the process by which a weakness is identified is often in conjunction with an individual's weakness in character armor being pointed out and ostracized by another individual or through some kind of systemic feedback. It is a burden for an individual to accept this criticism of their character armor, as the individual must earnestly admit the weakness to be true and consequently take action to construct a stronger link of armor to replace the weak armor. This is an act that generally enforces a large cognitive cost upon the individual. We can observe that most individuals are reluctant to admit a weakness in their character armor and to actually resolve that weakness. A weakness in character armor is not equivalent to a weakness in one's ability to cook a steak on a grill. A weakness in character armor identifies a miscalculated axiom or conclusion in the framework by which the individual has been using to live their life. This can be a cause for what many refer to as an identity or existential crisis. But truthfully, who is to blame? How natural is it for one to defend their actions of their life? Who enjoys admitting their wrongdoings? No one. Even if being wrong means one can now go on living a better life in the future, most are still reluctant to admit their ignorance. But in truth, But in truth, is all one's life simply the admittance of one's ignorance upon the realization that one was ignorant? And that non-admittance, self-induced after the realization, is a further and more sinister form of ignorance? This more sinister form of ignorance is propagating throughout modern civilization and, exacerbated by the multitude of interconnectedness, continues its expansion. We can use the analogy of alcohol use disorder, otherwise known as AUD, and how it translates to the idea of character armor of an individual in modern civilization. The NIAAA, that is, the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, categorizes AUD in a typical process by which AUD develops. 1. Alcohol produces pleasure. 2. Habit formation of pleasurable experiences makes it harder to stop drinking. 3. Alcohol initially reduces but then promotes negative emotional states and pain. 4. The brain becomes motivated to continue drinking. And 5. Executive function becomes dysregulated. One, alcohol produces pleasure. It is thought that in the basal ganglia, opioid receptors associated with pleasure are activated in the brain during alcohol consumption. Additionally, dopamine signals in the brain are generated and transmitted and thought to be responsible for relating certain categories of people, places, things, and actions as being directly related to the rewarding effects of alcohol. The process of alcohol consumption can otherwise be considered a process of motivation for reward that is driven by both a person's current physiological state and previously learned associations between people, places, things, or actions with the reward. We can observe that some consume alcohol for its positive effects and others consume alcohol to dampen out or numb themselves from a current negative experience or emotional state. Habit formation makes it harder to stop drinking. As an individual develops a habit of alcohol consumption, their brain gradually begins to move control of the actions associated with drinking. The act of drinking alcohol started with a conscious choice that was, quote-unquote, decided by an individual through the use of their prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for, quote-unquote, conscious decision-making. Over time, if an individual incorporates a pattern of drinking, for example, Friday and Saturday night every weekend for the majority of 1 year or their lifetime, the brain moves the control from the prefrontal cortex to the basal ganglia, where it becomes ingrained and formed in the individual's brain as a habit in the truest sense of the word, identical to the habit of brushing one's teeth every morning and every night. 3. Alcohol initially reduces but then promotes negative emotional states and pain. Upon initial consumption of alcohol, in the adolescence of the habit, activity in the amygdala can be dampened out. The amygdala is responsible for the fight or flight stress response and functions as a mechanism for an individual to associate certain things as dangerous or as a potential threat. We can see that when an individual consumes alcohol, the part of the brain that regulates what we would call anxiety gets numbed and dampened out. However, excessive or prolonged alcohol use may lead to a tolerance. In other words, to achieve the same state of reduced anxiety, i.e., the same level of dampened amygdala function, more and more alcohol is required. Additionally, when one now wishes to stop drinking after a prolonged period of time, the amygdala may reverse its function and overcompensate, meaning, in withdrawal, the circuitry of the amygdala becomes hyperactive, facilitating heightened levels of negative emotional states, such as anxiety or other flight or fight or flight emotions. This discomfort can mean that an individual going through withdrawal can experience a large magnitude of feelings such as irritability, anxiety, dysphoria, or emotional pain. This discomfort, caused by a hyperactive, overcompensating amygdala, creates a vicious cycle The individual is convinced, in the midst of what we may describe as a sorrowful and anguish-filled withdrawal experience, that the only way to rid themselves of the misery and the pain is to consume more alcohol. Four. Take a deep breath here. The brain becomes motivated to continue drinking. The cause of the individual's misery is also a solution. As Camus points out of Sisyphus in the myth of Sisyphus, quote, "The lucidity that was to constitute his torture at the same time crowns his victory. There is no fate that cannot be surmounted by scorn." Page 23. The cause of the individual's misery is also a solution. While alcohol was being consumed, the plasticity of the brain was responsible for creating the differing reward circuits. Over time, as a tolerance was developed, as we have described above, a withdrawal becomes excruciatingly nasty, and the individual's brain circuitry, due to the effects of alcohol chemically and the habitual formations the individual has developed in accordance with that chemical response, has attached a strong motivational value to the people, places, things, and actions or behaviors associated with alcohol. The people, places, things, or actions/behaviors can be in the immediate environment but also recalled from memory. These environmental stimuli or thoughts of them can prompt a return to alcohol-seeking behavior via the strong connections made between the stimuli and the pleasure associated with the stimuli. The individual may then be tricked into thinking that the only solution to their miserable withdrawal symptoms will be alcohol. The individual feels anxious and unpleasurable emotions, but, well, what substance and activity has the individual conditioned themselves both behaviorally and neurobiologically? What substance has the individual conditioned themselves into reducing their anxiety and giving them pleasure at the same time? Well, alcohol. The cause becomes the solution and a vicious cycle ensues. 5. Executive function becomes dysregulated. Over time, the areas of the brain, the prefrontal cortical areas in particular, associated with executive function, impulse control, decision-making, and emotional regulation become completely disrupted. If these areas of the brain are disrupted, it will be more difficult for the individual to make responsible, healthy choices that help the individual actually overcome their addiction. The vicious feedback loop begins as such. In the basal ganglia, intoxication of alcohol creates a withdrawal and negative effect in the amygdala after prolonged alcohol use. The prefrontal cortex then begins to learn and be preoccupied or anticipate the same behavior that then leads back to the binge and the intoxication of the substance. And the feedback continues. The loop continues. So in a sense, the prefrontal cortex becomes conditioned, and over time, it is affected so much that it is no longer actually able to use logic or rationality to think. Okay. Alcohol use disorder as an analog to closed-loop character armor. We can now translate this process of alcohol use disorder onto the process in modern civilization we would refer to as a closed-loop feedback system disorder of the mind. The NIAAA categorizes the process of alcohol use disorder as such. Alcohol produces pleasure. Habit formation of pleasurable experiences makes it harder to stop drinking. Alcohol initially reduces but then promotes negative emotional states and pain. The brain becomes motivated to continue drinking, and then, finally, executive function becomes dysregulated. We can translate this process into the process by which an individual develops character armor and the effect character armor has on the individual and modern civilization. An individual is born, habit formation makes it hard to reverse deeply ingrained experiences and perception. Social systems initially reduce but inevitably promote negative emotional states and pain. The brain becomes motivated to find solace in the habit formation and framework from the social systems that the individual abides by. And finally, again, executive function becomes dysregulated. Number 1, an individual is born. With no rhythm or rhyme, we are born into a situation that we have no control over. We are given a family and a location in space and time, and thus inherit a framework for living life. We are given a name by which we first use to shape our idea of the identity. Who am I? From birth, an individual is given solutions to their problems. All a child has to do is cry, and all of their issues are resolved. As an individual grows, we can associate the habits the individual learns as being an association with pleasure and actions that reduce anxiety. In modern civilization, we can see the various forms of pleasurable and anxiety-reducing actions as increasing, available to any and all at a very low cost, money-wise or energy-wise. Exactly the same as alcohol, when the individual begins forming habits in relation to things they have been told are, quote, the correct thing to do or the correct thing to think, dopamine signals are generated and transmitted throughout the brain, where the individual is learning to associate these certain habits, people, places, things, or ideas as being directly proportional to the rewarding effects of dopamine, or pleasure, and with the dampening of the amygdala, or the dampening, in other words, of anxiety. The habits that an individual forms are constructed in a way that says, this is the correct thing to do, as an expression of your innate and instinctual emotional circuitry. As we can see with social media, various substances, and so on and so forth, the list goes on, the means by which individuals growing up in our current modern civilization, the means these individuals have are for pleasure and dampening of anxiety is ubiquitous and all-encompassing. But we also need to understand that in addition to things such as social media and substance use, the very ethical framework that an individual's family adheres to uses the exact same mechanism of reward-seeking behavior. If an individual goes to church their entire life until the age of 12, for example, they will be told and figure out along the way that going to church has a specific reason, and that this reason is justified, and perhaps this justification is something rather like this. Church is good. We, as a family, want to be and remain good. Therefore, we will go to church. Thus, the child then lives the first 12 years of their life creating neural circuitry that resembles this. I've gone to church every Sunday my entire life and twice on Easter because going to church is a good thing. And by good thing, I mean that it makes me and my family associate pleasure and anxiety reduction with the act of going to church. Because me and my family want to be good, and this is what we believe to be good. Now, this is not to say that church and religion is bad. Quite the contrary. We are not critiquing that at this moment. We can use this example, this is just an example, as one situation a child may grow up in. There are many others. We can use this example, however, as an instance that everybody may be familiar with, or at least will understand very easily. But we can also imagine a scenario where the family is not religious, as I just said, but has other habits and frameworks they abide by in order to produce pleasure and to be able to make sense and go about their lives and existence. I have put emphasis on the nature of the family that an individual is born into, but this, of course, is not the only factor in what the individual has to go through in relation to their neural circuitry. Subcultures, school, friends, rituals, extraneous experiences, and so on all add up in the formula of how the individual learns to roam about their lives and existence as a whole. From birth, specifically, the individual constructs their brain around what feels good and what does not, what produces anxiety and what produces pleasure. There's an abundance of data to show how childhood experiences largely impact the worldview that an adult abides by. The habit formation of the individual, and thus the very way the individual learns to function in the world and live their life, becomes deeply ingrained not only as a historical treatise, but as a solidified part of the structure of the individual's neural circuitry. The specifics of the individual's upbringing, of which many factors in the upbringing were outside the control of the individual, give way to an underlying framework by which the individual uses to build their identity, consciously and unconsciously, which includes reward-seeking and anxiety-reducing behavior. 2. Habit formation makes it hard to reverse deeply ingrained experiences and perceptions. As the individual develops the various actions, ideologies, and frameworks for how they go about living life, their brain has gradually made connections with the things the individual has done to release dopamine or pleasure and reduce anxiety, creating a large number of associations that connect people, places, ideas, actions, and other things with the feeling of stability or homeostasis of some kind. Additionally, the brain has also created an association that connects certain people, places, ideas, and behavior with the feeling of anxiety and non-pleasurable things. This idea communicates, to the best of my ability, why we have a lot of problems regarding particularly psychological health in modern civilization. We can see that an individual's upbringing has a massive effect on how the individual learns to associate different things in their life with either pleasure or anxiety. As the individual becomes more self-reliant on their path toward adulthood, the people, places, ideas, and behaviors they have learned to associate with pleasure and anxiety have essentially become ingrained into the individual as habits. In this sense, the brain no longer sees a need to use the prefrontal cortex as a mechanism for deciding consciously whether or not the action, idea, person, place, or thing is quote-unquote good. These specific habits, in congruence with how one has gone about living their life, are now cemented in the basal ganglia and in the circuitry in the brain. The individual knows what actions are good or bad and doesn't have to actively question most of these actions to attempt an uncovering of whether or not the action is actually good or bad. 3. Social systems initially reduce but inevitably promote negative emotional states and pain. The social systems in place have evolved to solidify the pleasurable and anxiety-reducing habits that the individual has developed in their lifetime. We can also deduce that the social systems incentivize an individual to maintain a stronghold on the things that produce pleasure for the individual, while simultaneously deterring things that produce anxiety in the individual. I do not need to delve deep into the various incentives and deterrents that are rampant and clearly observable in modern civilization. All one would have to do is to take a couple days and observe others and their own measures of avoidance and escapism. The majority of the social systems eloquently reduce anxiety and promote pleasure for the individual on a local level. It is worth mentioning that the social systems do not actually even need to promote a habit that gives pleasure or anxiety to the individual, due to the nature of how an individual's upbringing affects their framework for living life. Various social systems simply need to just propagate a mechanism that allows the individual to maintain their already constructed habits of pleasure and anxiety reduction. With the immensely powerful and all-encompassing ubiquitous social systems in place, we can observe that while these systems help an individual maintain their deeply ingrained habits of pleasure and anxiety reduction, the long-term detriment of an individual's unwillingness to update their habits of pleasure is inevitably going to face detrimental effects in the long term. Specifically, we can use the example of a common concept referred to as an intervention. If a friend of an individual is worried about a particular habit the individual is partaking in, the friend will feel inclined to speak up. the friend will speak up and explain why they are worried. Time and time again, the individual is reluctant to clearly understand how the friend could say such a thing. If the particular habit has been deeply ingrained into the individual, we will say that it has been deeply ingrained over a long period of time, and perhaps even from birth. If this habit has been deeply ingrained as a mechanism for the individual to feel safe, secure, joyous, then the individual's brain circuitry will reflect this deeply ingrained habit as a piece of the pie in the brain's reward, pleasure, pain, anxiety, dessert platter. This habit has been formulated, perhaps through no fault of the individual, and subsequently solidified and cemented by the various social systems. If the friend of the individual feels the need for an intervention, it will be due to the fact that the friend has seen signs of the individual expressing negative emotional states or pain or misery and so on. The individual may be completely oblivious to this habit that has been ingrained as a habit capable of inducing pleasure or reducing anxiety, but that it is no longer producing pleasure and is in fact only producing misery and the like. In order for the individual to admit this, they have to become vulnerable to the idea that the habit they have been doing in their framework for living their life may be wrong, or more so, simply may not have been as good as they might have thought it to be. This is an immediate cause for the individual to reflect upon their life and their past, which is an activity that by definition causes a lot of anxiety and a lot of cognitive energy. Could something that an individual was doing really have been not good or in need of being updated? How could I have been so dumb, they say. It is clear now that the thing is foolish, illogical, and ignorant. The individual may say to themselves, upon the realization that a habit they felt was justified, is actually an insidious malfeasance to both themselves and the people around them. However, who or what is to blame? 4. The brain becomes motivated, or is there no blame at all? 4. The brain becomes motivated to find solace in the habit formation and framework that an individual abides by. Essentially, there is a closed-loop feedback system in this paper where it is in regards to ideology and conceptualizations, but it is really in regard to all things. Anything outside the purview of the closed loop, in this case, is a threat to the closed loop. For an individual to be exposed to a person, place, thing, behavior, idea, or concept that lies outside the realm of their current closed loop feedback system, which is the framework for them living their life, they immediately, or perhaps unconsciously, become anxious. Their amygdala has essentially been dampened by continuous mechanisms in this closed-loop feedback system that have deceived the amygdala into thinking, quote, there is no threat, danger, or stress in my closed-loop feedback system. Everything is dandy. Oh no, an unfamiliar idea that has fallen outside of my safe and secure closed-loop feedback system. I am distraught with anxiety and fear and trembling. All systems go. I am in hyperactive mode. And thus, wanting to get rid of these feelings of anxiety, naturally, the individual falls back on their closed-loop feedback system to refute and reject the new idea or concept they have not been exposed to. No, this does not happen all the time, but generally this is likely what will happen, and very likely the cause of all the polarization we may see in the realm of ideas in our current civilization. To refuse or reject a new idea, one is easily able to rely back on their closed-loop feedback system, where they know the closed-loop feedback system will provide comfort, security, pleasure, and the like. We can say that over time, the plasticity of the individual's brain has constructed the closed-loop feedback system as a way for the individual to successfully move about and experience life. And, exactly as with alcohol, any withdrawal or exposure that thrusts the individual outside of their closed-loop feedback system is a first-rate quick ticket to the individual feeling completely vulnerable to the elements of irritability, anxiety, dysphoria, and general confusion. Thus, in an attempt to rid oneself of this vulnerability to feeling these miserable emotions, the individual attempts to rush back into that which they know to be secure, which, of course, is their already formulated and cemented closed-loop feedback system for living their life. As we say with alcohol, the cause of the individual's misery is also a solution. The cause of the individual feeling anxious, that is, being exposed to an idea or concept or thing or experience that is outside their current closed-loop feedback system, is also a solution. An individual having a closed-loop feedback system that is so deeply ingrained in how they view and perceive existence is a route to the individual becoming vulnerable and anxious when they are exposed to a view, action, idea, or thing outside of their closed-loop feedback system. And thus, the closed-loop feedback system is the cause of anxiety. And due to the system being closed, the individual feels the only solution to this anxiety is to revert themselves back into the security and comfort and safety of their already established closed-loop feedback system. And therefore, the closed-loop feedback system is also the solution to the unpleasurable emotions and anxiety. Over time, the closed-loop feedback system that an individual develops becomes the shielding and protection that they use to feel safe, secure, and heroic in how they roam about their life and existence. The mechanisms of neurobiology, social systems, and the self-righteous inclinations are what we now refer to as character armor. 5. Executive function becomes dysregulated. The product we have seen unfold in our modern civilization can be seen through the lens we have just articulated. We can observe how individuals have solidified a closed-loop feedback system where new ideas and concepts are immediately shunned and rejected, while usually also rejecting and shunning the vessels communicating such ideas or concepts. That is, a person operating on a closed-loop feedback system will reject the unfamiliar idea out of a necessity to protect themselves from anxiety, usually unconsciously. From the anxiety they will experience while having to contemplate and ponder an idea or concept they are unfamiliar with. Perhaps a ponderance that would take a tremendous amount of time and energy to fully understand. Furthermore, they will typically also reject the person communicating the unfamiliar idea, shunning this person and immediately categorizing them as dumb, foolish, unwise, and any of the ists, because this is the only way they may get rid of the anxiety and feel safe or secure. This creates disagreement, confusion, and at times utter chaos and polarization between individuals on a local and global scale. The paradox lies in the realization that the disagreement, confusion, and chaos all stem from all individuals adhering to an action that they believe is going to reduce their anxiety and allow them to continue feeling pleasure or otherwise being, quote-unquote, happy. Conclusion. Thus, we have seen the psychosocial aspects of character armor and how it develops. The impacts these dynamics have on individuals are tremendously important to understand. The interconnectedness between the neurobiology of the individual and the social systems that the individual is embedded within create the conditions by which the individual goes about living their life. Further research must be dedicated to understanding how the current social systems may deal with these processes poorly and how we may modify or construct new social systems that will allow the individual to honestly develop the heroic potential that resides within them.